This episode, The Weight of Duty. Seaman Carl Fischer stood on the deck of U-58, a German U-boat patrolling the cold Atlantic waters. The biting wind stung his cheeks as he stared at the endless expanse of water. The salty air carried whispers of distant conflicts, echoes of a world embroiled in chaos. Below deck, the rhythmic hum of the submarine's engines reverberated through the steel hull, a constant reminder of their deadly mission beneath the waves. Carl was a young sailor, only 24, yet already burdened with the heavy weight of service. He had joined the Imperial German Navy with dreams of honor and valor, eager to defend his fatherland. But as the war dragged on, those dreams had been tarnished by the grim realities of modern warfare. The doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare had been a contentious issue within the German Navy. Carl had always been conflicted about it. The idea of sinking enemy ships without warning, targeting not just military vessels but also merchant ships and liners, weighed heavily on his conscience. He understood the strategic necessity. Cutting off Britain's supplies could turn the tide of the war, but the collateral damage, the loss of innocent lives, haunted him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the restless sea, the lookout's urgent voice broke through Carl's reverie. "Captain, to all hands, we've spotted a vessel on the horizon, bearing northeast. It appears to be a large liner." Carl's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Ever since the sinking of the Lusitania, the specter of that tragedy had loomed over him. The thought of innocent passengers, families, and children perishing in the cold depths of the ocean was unbearable. But orders were orders. He descended into the control room with the rest of the crew, where the tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken fears and doubts. Carl took his position, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared for the commands that would soon follow. Captain Herzog Werner, a seasoned naval officer at the age of 68, had commanded numerous vessels throughout his long career. But this was his first assignment aboard a U-boat. He stood at the periscope, his expression a mask of stern determination. The crew awaited his command, each man executing his duties with mechanical precision, fully aware of the gravity of their mission beneath the waves. "Prepare to dive," Werner ordered, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of hesitation. The crew complied, and Carl watched as the periscope was raised, giving the captain a clear view of their target. The liner was a majestic sight, its sleek lines cutting through the water with grace and power. Carl could imagine the passengers on the deck, oblivious to the danger lurking below. Families, children, men, and women who had no part in the war, who had no idea that their fates were about to be sealed with the press of a button. "Set torpedo tubes 1 and 2, Werner commanded. The crew complied, their faces a mask of grim determination. Carl could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to overwhelm his resolve. Werner turned to Carl, his eyes hardening. "Fire the torpedo," he ordered. Carl hesitated, his finger hovering over the button. Doubts and fears surged within him, the cries of the Lusitania's victims echoing in his mind. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. His heart pounded, his breath caught in his throat. "Fire, damn it!" Werner barked, his voice breaking the spell. Carl pressed the button, but his moment of hesitation had already altered the torpedo's trajectory. It shot from the tube, slicing through the water towards its target. Moments later, it detonated, but not with the catastrophic force they had anticipated. The liner shuddered under the impact but remained afloat, the torpedo having veered off course and missed its mark. Silence filled the control room, the crew staring at Carl with a mix of shock and anger. Werner's face contorted with rage. "We have to get out of here," Werner barked. "All hands, full throttle to starboard. Initiate evasive maneuvers and follow all protocols." His gaze locked onto Carl. "You did that on purpose," Werner accused, his voice a low growl that echoed through the control room. The crew's eyes bore into Carl, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fury. "I didn't mean to," Carl stammered, his voice trembling. "It was a mistake. A mistake that cost us a critical target and could lead to our discovery. Do you understand the danger we are in right now?" Werner snapped. He turned to the crew. When we reach safety, we will address this breach of duty, this treason. The word treason hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the crew and suffocating any hope of camaraderie. 3 hours later, the U 58 ascended, the pressure change filling the submarine with groans and creaks. As they broke the surface, Werner ordered the crew to assemble in the cramped mess hall. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Werner stood at the head of the room, his stern gaze sweeping over the assembled sailors. This is a serious matter. Seaman Fisher's hesitation has potentially jeopardized our mission and by extension the war effort. We cannot afford such errors. One of the senior sailors, a grizzled veteran named Hans, stepped forward. Captain, are you suggesting we hold a court-martial here? On the submarine? Werner nodded grimly. Yes, Hans. This is a matter of discipline and duty. We will convene a court of his peers to determine the appropriate course of action. Carl felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. A kangaroo court, right here on the submarine, with no chance for a fair trial. He looked around at the faces of his fellow sailors, many of whom he had considered friends. Now, they were his judges. The makeshift trial began, with Werner acting as both prosecutor and judge. Hans and two other senior sailors were appointed as the jury. Carl stood at attention, trying to maintain his composure as the accusations flew. Seaman Fisher, Werner began, his voice cold and impersonal. You're charged with gross negligence and dereliction of duty. Your hesitation in firing the torpedo has raised suspicion of intentional sabotage. How do you plead? Carl swallowed hard. Not guilty, sir. It was a mistake, not sabotage. Werner's eyes narrowed. The evidence suggests otherwise. You've been vocal about your reservations regarding unrestricted submarine warfare. Is it not true that you have expressed concern about the loss of innocent lives? Carl hesitated, knowing that his honesty could be his undoing. Yes, sir, I have concerns, but I have always followed orders. Yet, in this crucial moment, you hesitated, Werner pressed. Why? Carl struggled to find the words. I was thinking of the people on that ship, the innocent lives. I didn't want to be responsible for another tragedy like the Lusitania. Werner's expression hardened. Your duty is to follow orders, not to question them. Your hesitation has endangered this vessel and its crew. Do you have anything else to say in your defense? Carl looked around the room, seeing the faces of his comrades, some filled with anger, others with pity. I joined the Navy to defend my country, not to kill innocents. If that makes me guilty, then so be it. The room fell silent, the weight of Carl's words hanging in the air. Werner conferred briefly with the jury, then turned back to Carl. Seaman Fisher, you've been found guilty of gross negligence and dereliction of duty. The penalty for such actions is severe. However, given the circumstances, we'll consider your previous service. You're hereby sentenced to confinement for the remainder of this mission. Upon our return to port, you will face a formal court-martial. Carl felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Confined to quarters, he would be safe from the immediate wrath of his fellow sailors, but the looming threat of a formal court-martial upon their return to port weighed heavily on his mind. Werner's stern face was the last thing he saw before he was escorted to his tiny bunk, now his prison for the foreseeable future. The days blurred together in the dim, claustrophobic confines of his quarters. Carl could hear the distant hum of the submarine's machinery, the muffled conversations of the crew, and the occasional tense orders from Captain Werner. His thoughts were a storm of guilt, fear, and defiance. He replayed the moment he hesitated over and over in his mind, questioning his decision, his morality, and his sense of duty. One evening, the door to his quarters creaked open. It was Hans, the grizzled veteran who had been part of the jury. His face was stern, but his eyes held a hint of something softer, perhaps understanding, or maybe pity. How you holding up, Fisher? Hans asked, his voice low. Carl shrugged, not trusting himself to speak without betraying the turmoil inside him. Hans sighed and leaned against the bulkhead. You know, I've seen a lot of things in this war. Things that make you question everything you thought you knew about honor and duty, Hans said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Which you did, or rather what you didn't do, took guts. But it also put us all in danger. I know, Carl replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I just couldn't do it. Show me a naval vessel and I'll push that button with all the vigor of a soldier charging into battle. But that was no naval vessel. Those people on that ship, they're not even a part of this war. They're innocent. Hans nodded, his expression thoughtful. We all have our breaking points, Fisher, and our morals. The question is, can you live with the consequences? Carl didn't have an answer. Hans left him alone with his thoughts, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the small space. Days turned into weeks, and the U-58 continued its patrols. Carl's isolation gave him plenty of time to reflect, but it also gnawed at his sanity. He felt the submarine lurch and dive, heard the distant booms of depth charges and the occasional sound of torpedo launches. Each time, he wondered if another innocent ship was meeting its end because of the orders he couldn't follow. It was late at night when Carl was awoken by what felt like a violent explosion. Alarms blared and an announcement ordered the crew to their stations. Carl's door was flung open, and there stood Werner, his face grim. We've been hit. We're taking on water. We need all hands, Werner barked. Carl's heart raced as he followed Werner to the control room. The scene was chaos, with sailors working frantically to seal off flooded compartments and maintain buoyancy. Carl threw himself into the effort, his training taking over as he helped pump water and patch leaks. Hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. The crew's efforts paid off and the U-58 stabilized. Exhausted, Carl slumped against the bulkhead, his body aching from the exertion. Werner approached him, his expression unreadable. You did good work, Fisher. You saved lives today. Carl met Werner's gaze, seeing a flicker of respect in the captain's eyes. Thank you, sir. Werner nodded. We're not out of the woods yet. We need to make it back to port for repairs. You'll remain confined for now, but know that your actions today won't be forgotten. The journey back to port was tense but uneventful. The crew was exhausted, but there was a sense of camaraderie that had been missing before. Carl remained confined to his quarters, but his role in saving the submarine had earned him a measure of grudging respect from his fellow soldiers. As the U-58 finally docked, the weight of what awaited him settled heavily on his shoulders. Carl was escorted off the submarine under guard, his hands bound in front of him. The naval base was a stark contrast to the claustrophobic confines of the U-58, but it offered no solace. He was led to a small, austere room where his court-martial would take place. The room was filled with officers, their faces stern and impassive. Captain Werner was there, along with other senior officers from the base. A military judge presided over the proceedings, his presence imposing and unyielding. Seaman Carl Fischer, you are charged with gross negligence and dereliction of duty, actions that amount to an attempt at treason, leading to the failure of a critical mission. How do you plead? The judge intoned, his voice resonating in the small room. Carl swallowed hard. Not guilty, sir. It was a mistake, not sabotage. The prosecution presented its case succinctly, detailing Carl's hesitation and the missed torpedo strike. They emphasized the strategic importance of the target and the potential consequences of its survival. Witnesses were called, including Captain Werner. Seaman Fischer hesitated at a crucial moment, Werner stated, his voice firm. His actions endangered the mission and the lives of this crew. When asked to explain, Werner stated that when a torpedo is fired, it initially travels just below the surface of the water. This creates a weight that can be visible to the target, alerting them to its presence. Since the torpedo missed its mark, the weight could reveal their position, allowing the target to potentially radio enemy forces about their location, thereby putting the vessel in grave danger. Carl's defense was weak. He had no legal counsel, only his own words and the hope that his actions during the submarine's emergency might count in his favor. He spoke of his internal conflict, his fear of causing another tragedy like the Lusitania. He explained that his hesitation was not out of malice, but out of a deeply ingrained sense of morality. The judge listened impassively, his expression giving nothing away. When the prosecution and defense had finished, the judge conferred briefly with the other officers. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Seaman Fischer, the court finds you guilty of gross negligence and dereliction of duty, actions that could be deemed treasonous. Your actions whether born of conscience or fear, have endangered a vessel in the Kaiser's navy and thus cannot be tolerated. This treasonous act can only have one consequence, and that is death. Carl felt the world tilt beneath him. The words seemed surreal, a nightmare from which he could not wake. He was escorted to a courtyard, the cold wind biting into his cheeks once more. The sky was overcast, a fitting backdrop for what was to come. A small squad of soldiers stood ready, their rifles gleaming dully in the gray light. Carl was positioned against a wall, his hands tied behind his back. He could see some of the crew from the U-58 in the distance, their faces a mix of sorrow and resignation. Captain Werner approached him, his expression unreadable. "I take no pleasure in this, Fisher. You are a good sailor. But duty is duty." He turned and walked away. Carl nodded, unable to find the words. He looked up at the sky, taking in the cold gray clouds. He thought of his family and of the dreams he once had, now shattered by the harsh realities of war. The officer in charge of the firing squad stepped forward, his voice ringing out. "Ready?" Carl closed his eyes, a sense of calm washing over him. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. The weight of his actions and the lives they had affected pressed down on him. But in that moment, he found a strange kind of peace. Fire! Thank you for listening to World War I stories, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. I'm Henny B, your host and storyteller. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review for us wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again for more World War I stories.